In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And walls. Walls so high you've never seen the top. Walls so thick you've never heard the outside. Walls that are your entire world, until someone opens a door and pushes you through it. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about what's on the other side of the hive, the place no one who lives inside ever sees, because the ones who get sent out don't come back to talk about it. This is the story of a man with no name worth keeping, an underhive ganger exiled from Hive Sulgreth on a world called Vrethcairn, who spent 31 years understanding doors, and then watched the biggest one he'd ever seen close behind him forever. What's outside? Not a world, a crust. 8,000 years of industrial waste compacted into something that pretends to be ground. Air that burns like swallowed glass, mist that changes color depending on how fast it'll kill you. And silence, the kind with weight to it, the kind that fills the space where your entire life used to be. He walked because there was nothing else to do. What he found out there, I'll let him tell you. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The last thing you hear before you die is a sound you never knew existed. Not a scream, not a prayer, not the wet crack of bone or the hiss of a blade leaving its sheath. It is the sound of a door so massive, so ancient, so incomprehensibly heavy that when it moves, the vibration passes through your skeleton before it reaches your ears. You feel it in your molars first, then in the base of your skull, then in the arches of your feet, and by the time the actual noise arrives, a groan of metal that could swallow a crowd's roar whole. You understand with a clarity you have never possessed in your entire wretched life that this sound means exactly one thing. You are no longer inside. You are no longer part of the hive. You are nothing. Let me tell you something about doors. In the underhive of Sulgreth, on the world that the administratum ledgers call Vrethcairn, doors are the most important thing that exists. More important than water, more important than ammunition, more important than the fungal paste they scrape off the reclamation vats and press into bricks and call food. A door is the difference between living and not living. A door between you and the sump means you sleep another night without something crawling up from the drainage channels and laying eggs in your throat. A door between you and the next gang's territory means you eat what you stole without someone putting a rivet gun through the back of your head for it. I spent 31 years understanding doors, knowing which ones to open, which ones to leave shut, which ones to kick through at a dead sprint with a stub pistol in each hand, and a prayer to no one in particular, rattling between my teeth. 31 years of doors. And then the biggest one I had ever seen opened behind me, and the world I knew ended. They did not push me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Whoever is hearing this, whenever you are hearing this, understand that they did not push me. They did not need to. There were 6 of them, Gilder enforcers in carapace plate, with their faces hidden behind rebreather masks, and behind them was Overseer Brackhooth himself, a man I had seen exactly twice in my life, both times from a distance that made him look like a smudge of gold paint against the gray. He did not speak. None of them spoke. Brackhooth simply pointed at the open door, at that howling wound in the wall of the hive, and I walked. Not because I was brave, not because I had accepted my fate, because I had seen what happened to the ones who did not walk. A week before my exile, a woman named Getry from the Pipe Warrens near Sublevel 40 had been sentenced to the same door. She refused. She bit, she thrashed, she screamed until blood ran from her nostrils and her voice became a whistling croak. So they broke both her legs at the knee and threw her through anyway. I heard the sound she made when she landed. It was not a scream by that point. It was something smaller and worse. So I walked. The platform beyond the door was corroded metal grating, maybe 4 meters wide and twice that in length, jutting from the hive's outer shell like a broken tooth. It was an old maintenance platform, the kind that servitor crews would once have used to repair damage to the shell's lower sections, though I doubt anything had been maintained out here in centuries. The grating was so eaten through by corrosion that I could see down through it, and what I saw beneath was a drop so deep and so dark that it did not seem to have a bottom, just blackness. Blackness and the faintest shimmer of something wet, catching a light source I could not identify. The air was not air. I need to say that plainly. What came through that door and into my lungs was not what I had been breathing for 31 years. The atmosphere inside the underhive was foul, yes, recycled through filters that had not been properly serviced since before my grandmother's grandmother was born, thick with the smell of unwashed humanity and chemical sealant and the sour tang of reclaimed water. But it was air. It went in, it came out, it kept you alive. What waited beyond the door was something else. The first breath burned, not like fire, like swallowing a fistful of ground glass that had been soaked in something acidic. My throat closed immediately, a spasm that was pure animal reflex, my body trying to reject the atmosphere before it could reach my lungs. I doubled over on the grating and retched, and what came out of my mouth was tinged pink. The second breath was worse because I knew what was coming and my body fought it, and I had to force myself to inhale, to override every screaming nerve that said, "This will kill you, this is poison, stop." The third breath was the one that settled into a pattern, a raw, shallow, burning pattern that made every subsequent inhalation feel like running a serrated blade down the inside of my chest, but a pattern nonetheless, something I could survive. For now. The door closed behind me, that sound again, that deep geological groan of metal against metal, of mechanisms older than the memory of anyone living inside the hive. I did not turn around to watch it close. There was nothing to see. A wall of gray metal, featureless and absolute, sealing itself with the finality of a coffin lid. The sound of the locks engaging was percussive, a sequence of heavy bolts slamming home that I felt in my ribcage, each one a sentence in a language that needed no translation. You are out. You stay out. You were never here. The mist swallowed the sound before it could echo, and then there was silence. Not real silence. Not the silence of the underhive, which was always populated by the distant rumble of industry and the hiss of pressurized pipes and the muffled sounds of human misery filtering through hab-block walls. This was a different silence, a wet silence, a silence with weight to it, pressing against my eardrums, filling the spaces between sounds with a thickness that felt almost physical. Somewhere far away and far below, something dripped. Somewhere further, something groaned, metal or stone or something that was neither. The hive's outer skin contracting and expanding, with thermal changes I could not feel, but that the ancient structure could, creaking like the bones of a dying god. I should tell you why I was exiled, because you deserve to know who is speaking to you and what kind of man he is. I was a ganger, underhive vermin, the lowest kind of creature the hive produces, which is saying something because the hive produces things that would make an inquisitor lose his appetite. I ran with a crew called the Sulphur Teeth. Not a large crew, not a powerful one. 12 of us at our peak, operating out of a decommissioned water treatment facility between sublevels 38 and 42. We did what underhive gangs do. We fought over territory that was worth nothing. We stole supplies from convoys that were already carrying stolen supplies. We killed people for reasons that seemed important at the time and meaningless within a week. I was not the leader. I was not even particularly good at violence, despite having spent most of my adult life practicing it. What I was good at was finding things. Paths between levels that the maps did not show. Doors that had been sealed for generations but could still be forced with the right tools and the right knowledge. Passages through the dead infrastructure of the hive's guts, where the walls were warm with diverted heat and the floors were sticky with centuries of leaked coolant. I was a rat, in the truest sense. I knew the walls better than I knew anything else, including myself. The thing that got me exiled was not a murder, though I had committed those. It was not theft, though I had committed that too, many times over. It was a door, a specific door on sublevel 19 that I should never have opened. The territory above sublevel 25 was Guilder territory, controlled and patrolled and locked behind security that was supposed to be impenetrable. The Guilders are not a gang. They are the commercial elite of the lower mid-hive, the merchant class that controls the flow of goods between the underhive and the productive levels above. They answer to the noble houses of the spire, and the noble houses answer to the planetary governor, and the planetary governor answers to the sector's imperial commander, and so on and upward in a chain of authority that eventually, theoretically, leads all the way to the Golden Throne itself. The Guilders maintained their control through a very simple principle. The underhive needed what came down from above: food, medicine, ammunition, replacement parts for the ancient machinery that kept the lower levels marginally habitable. The Guilders controlled what came down. Therefore, the Guilders controlled the underhive. But I found a door on sublevel 19, a forgotten maintenance access that led into a section of the hive's thermal regulation system, a vast network of pipes and ducts and heat exchangers that ran vertically through the hive's entire structure like a circulatory system. And through that system, if you were thin enough and stupid enough and desperate enough, you could bypass the Guilder checkpoints entirely. You could reach the mid-hive without paying the tolls, without asking permission, without kneeling before some merchant princeling in his gilt-edged coat and begging for the privilege of buying food at 300% markup. But the passage itself was strange. I noticed it the third or fourth time I used it. The walls of the thermal system were metal, standard hive infrastructure, but in places deep in the lowest sections near the foundations, the metal was covered by something else, something that was not rust, not corrosion, not the mineral buildup that accumulates inside pipes over centuries. It was soft, warm. It yielded under pressure, and it had a texture that my fingers understood, even if my mind refused to classify. I mentioned it to Dranok, our leader, described how the walls in the deep passage felt wrong, how they were warm in places where they should have been cold, how they seemed to pulse if you pressed your palm flat and held still long enough. She told me to shut my mouth and keep running supplies. I mentioned it to a pipe fitter on sub-level 30 who owed me a favor. He went quiet, and 2 days later he was dead, crushed by a section of corridor wall that supposedly collapsed due to structural fatigue. I stopped mentioning it, but I think the wrong people had already heard. I did not keep the bypass route to myself either. That was the other mistake, the visible one, the one that gave them an excuse. A smarter man would have used it quietly, running his own supplies, building his own little empire one careful trip at a time. I told the Sulphur Teeth, and the Sulphur Teeth told other gangs, and within 2 months the Guilder's checkpoint revenue on our section of the Underhive had dropped by 40%. It took them another month to find the passage. It took them 2 days to find me. There was no trial. There are no trials in the Underhive. The official reason was the smuggling route, the revenue, the insult to Guilder authority. But I have thought about it many times since, and I do not believe that a 40% revenue drop on a minor underhive checkpoint warrants the personal attention of Overseer Brakuth. Brakuth did not come to the Exile door for smugglers. Brakuth came because someone above him, someone with access to information about what grew in the foundations of the hive, had told him to make a specific problem disappear. There was Brakuth and his enforcers, and the door, and the burning air, and the silence, and the mist. And that is where my story really begins, standing on a corroded grating above an abyss, breathing poison, with 31 years of worthless experience and nothing else. The mist. I need to talk about the mist because it defined everything that came after. It was not fog. Fog is water. Fog is something your body understands, something that sits on your skin and feels familiar even when it obscures your vision. This was chemical. The ash wastes of Vrethcairn are not ash in any natural sense. They are the accumulated industrial waste of 8,000 years of continuous production, ground and reground by corrosive winds, until the particles are fine enough to hang in the atmosphere like smoke. Mixed with the moisture that seeps up from the hive's thermal outflows and the chemical runoff from the manufactoria above, this particulate creates a permanent ground-level haze that is sometimes thin enough to see through and sometimes so thick that you cannot see your own hands. It changes color depending on what it is carrying. Gray is the most common, the baseline. Yellow means sulfur compounds, usually blown in from the acid flats to the north. Anything with a greenish tint means you need to cover your skin immediately because it is carrying something that will eat through exposed flesh in minutes. I did not know any of this at the time. I learned it later in the way that the ash wastes teach you everything through pain and proximity to death. The platform had a ladder. Rusted, missing rungs, swaying slightly in a wind I could not feel but that existed somewhere above me. A thermal current generated by the temperature differential between the hive's heated shell and the frigid waste beyond. I climbed down because there was nowhere else to go. The grating beneath my feet was the only solid ground I could see, and below it was a ladder. And at the bottom of the ladder was either more solid ground or death. And at that point, the distinction between the two seemed academic. The descent was perhaps 30 meters. I cannot be certain because I was counting by feel rather than by sight. Each rung a small victory. Each gap where a rung had corroded away a small crisis, requiring me to stretch and grope and trust my weight to metal that groaned under even my modest mass. I was not a large man. The underhive does not produce large men. It produces wiry, dense, compact creatures built for fitting through tight spaces and surviving on less food than a ratling would consider adequate. This worked in my favor as I descended, the ladder protesting but holding, and eventually my feet touched something that was not a rung, ground, or what passed for it. The surface of the ash waste at the base of Hive Sulgreth was not ground in any way I understood the concept. It was a crust, a compacted layer of waste material that had solidified over centuries into something resembling stone, but was fundamentally less stable. My boots, standard underhive work boots with the plasteel toes that every ganger wore, because kicking was sometimes more practical than shooting, sank about 3 centimeters into it before finding resistance. The crust held. I took a step. It held again. Another step. I was walking on the surface of a world I had never seen, on a planet I had lived my entire life on without ever once being outside its walls. Above me, the hive rose. I had seen pictures, of course. Everyone in the underhive had seen pictures, crude drawings in children's primers, or faded prints in the propaganda chapels where the manufactorum preachers told us that the emperor loved us and that our suffering was sacred. But pictures are flat. Pictures are contained within frames. The hive was not flat, and it was not contained. It went up. It went up so far and so completely that my mind rejected it. The base of the structure was a wall of metal and rockcrete that stretched in both directions until the mist swallowed it, curving very slightly, the curvature of something so vast that its shape could only be perceived at a scale my eyes were not designed to process. And above that wall, disappearing into the chemical haze, the body of the hive continued upward, a mountain of metal, a geological formation made of human industry, its surface scarred and pitted and streaked with the residue of ages. Somewhere up there, too far up to see, too far up to imagine, were the spires, the places where the air was clean and the light was real and the people ate food that had never been anyone else first. I had been inside that structure my entire life. I had never understood how large it was until I was outside it, looking up, feeling the sheer physical mass of it pressing down on the world like a tumor. I turned away from the hive. There was nothing for me there anymore. The door was sealed, the wall was sheer. The hive had excreted me like waste, and waste does not crawl back inside the body that produced it. Ahead of me was the ash waste. Visibility was maybe 20 meters in the current haze, though that changed constantly as the mist shifted and thickened and thinned according to patterns I could not predict. The ground was gray and uniform, a featureless expanse of compacted industrial residue that looked exactly the same in every direction. No landmarks, no features, nothing to navigate by. Just gray crust underfoot and gray haze all around, and the gray wall of the hive at my back, and somewhere above all of it, a sky I could not see. I started walking. I did not choose a direction. There was no basis on which to choose a direction. I simply picked the line that led most directly away from the hive and followed it, putting one foot in front of the other with the methodical stubbornness that is the underhive's only real gift to its children. We are very good at continuing. Not at thriving, not at hoping, not at planning for futures that will never arrive, but at continuing. At putting one foot in front of the other when every rational calculation says there is no point. I continued. There is a thing that happens to the mind when it is removed from everything it has ever known and placed into an environment that offers no reference points, no familiar textures, no recognizable sounds. It does not panic, not immediately. Panic requires the belief that a situation can change, that action can produce a result, that the danger is temporary and survivable. What the mind does instead, when it is placed into a condition of total environmental alienation, is go quiet. The internal monologue, that constant narration that accompanies every waking moment in the underhive, commenting on threats and opportunities and the thousand small negotiations that constitute daily survival, simply stops. The machinery of thought idles. The gears continue turning, but they are not engaged with anything, spinning in place, producing motion without movement. I walked in that silence for hours. My body performed the act of locomotion, and my mind performed the act of nothing, and together we covered ground that meant nothing across a surface that went nowhere. The rain started about an hour into my walk. I knew it was rain because it fell from above and it was wet. And those are the two criteria that define rain in the understanding of someone who has never experienced weather. But it was not water. It stung. The first drops hit the exposed skin on my hands, and I felt each one as a tiny point of heat, not severe, not immediately painful, but wrong. By the time I thought to pull my sleeves down over my hands, the rain had intensified, and I could see it doing something to the fabric of my jacket. The surface of the material was bubbling, tiny, delicate bubbles forming where the droplets had landed, as though the rain were dissolving the outer layer of the cloth. I pulled my collar up over my mouth and nose, more out of instinct than knowledge, and hunched forward, making myself as small a target as possible. The rain was eating my clothes. It was not doing it quickly. It was not the dramatic, flesh-dissolving acid rain of the horror stories that underhive mothers told to keep their children from asking too many questions about the outside. It was patient, methodical, a slow, persistent corrosion that would take hours to eat through my jacket and days to reach skin, but was absolutely, undeniably, irreversibly happening. I was being consumed by the weather. Not attacked, not assaulted. Consumed, digested, broken down into component parts by an atmosphere that treated organic matter and industrial waste with identical indifference. That was when I understood for the first time what outside actually meant. Not a place, not a location on a map. A process, a digestive process. Everything outside the hive was being broken down. Everything. The ground beneath my feet was not ground. It was the end product of millennia of breakdown. The mist was not mist, it was the airborne component of the same process. The rain was not rain, it was the active agent of dissolution. The hive had not expelled me into a wasteland. It had expelled me into a stomach. I walked for what I believe was 2 days, though I cannot be certain because there was no sun, no stars, no change in the quality of the light filtering through the chemical overcast. The haze carried its own diffuse illumination, a directionless gray-yellow glow that never brightened and never fully darkened, creating a permanent twilight that made it impossible to mark the passage of time. I measured distance instead, counting steps, because I had nothing else to count, and I will tell you right now that the number was meaningless. Steps across a featureless waste with no destination and no reference points are not distance. They are repetition. They are the body performing its most basic function while the mind does something else entirely, and what my mind was doing was dying. Not in the dramatic sense, not collapsing in on itself or fracturing into madness, just quietly shutting down systems it no longer needed. Hope was the first to go, then planning, then curiosity. By the second day, I was a mechanism, legs and lungs and the dull rhythm of one foot after another, and the only thing keeping me going was the fact that stopping required a decision, and I was no longer capable of making decisions. The wreck appeared out of the mist like a hallucination. One moment there was nothing ahead of me but gray crust and gray haze. The next, a shape, dark, angular, wrong. It did not belong to the flatness of the waste. It had edges and surfaces and depth, and my eyes, starved of visual complexity for what felt like an eternity, locked onto it with an intensity that was almost painful. I stopped walking. The cessation of movement was so abrupt that I nearly fell, my body having calibrated itself to the rhythm of steps and suddenly finding itself without instructions. I stood and stared at the shape, and as I stared, the mist shifted and the shape became clearer, and what I was looking at was a vehicle. It was a cargo hauler, a big one, the kind of heavy transport that moved goods between hive clusters, armored against the ash storms and the things that lived in them, riding on tracks that were each wider than I was tall. It was lying on its side, half buried in the ash crust, its hull buckled and torn open along a seam that ran from the forward crew compartment to the rear cargo bay. The damage was not from an accident. The metal was peeled outward in places and inward in others, as though something had simultaneously pushed from inside and pulled from outside, and the patterns of stress and deformation told a story that I did not have the engineering knowledge to read, but that my gut understood perfectly. Something had happened to this vehicle, something that was not a crash, something that was not weather, something that had intentions. I climbed inside through the torn seam, because the alternative was to keep walking, and I had been walking for 2 days, and the rain had eaten through the outer layer of my jacket and was beginning to work on the lining beneath, and I needed shelter more than I needed caution. The interior was dark. The diffuse light from outside penetrated a few meters through the torn hull, but faded quickly, leaving the deeper sections in a blackness that was almost solid. I moved by touch, running my fingers along surfaces that were gritty with deposited ash and slick with something that was not water. The cargo bay was empty. Whatever this transport had been carrying was gone, removed or consumed or scattered across the wastes. But the crew compartment, when I reached it, was not empty. I need to describe what I found carefully, because it is important and because I have thought about it many times since, and I still do not fully understand it. There were shapes in the crew compartment, human-shaped, 4 of them, arranged in positions that suggested they had been sitting in their stations when whatever happened had happened. They were in the seats. Their hands were on the controls. Their posture was correct, but they were not bodies. They were skins. The exterior surface of 4 human beings, complete and unbroken, laid over the seats and control interfaces like discarded clothing. I touched one. I should not have, but I did because my mind was not functioning at its best, and because the thing I was looking at was so far outside my experience that I needed tactile confirmation that it was real. The skin was dry, papery. It crinkled under my fingers like parchment, and it was complete, not torn, not cut, not pulled apart, complete. Every finger, every fold of the ear, every crease of the eyelid, as though the person inside had simply been removed, extracted through some process that left the outer layer intact in every detail while taking everything else. Bones, muscles, organs, blood, everything that made a person, gone. The skin left behind like the shed casing of an insect, holding the shape of what it had once contained through the rigidity of dried tissue alone. I found their uniforms underneath the skins, pressed flat against the seat cushions. The fabric was intact. The buckles on their harnesses were still fastened. Whatever had hollowed them out had done so without disturbing their clothing, without unfastening their restraints, without leaving any sign of violence or struggle. 4 people had been sitting in this compartment, strapped into their seats, doing their jobs, and something had come and taken everything inside them and left the rest. I backed out of the crew compartment on hands and knees very quickly, with a sound coming out of my throat that was not quite a scream and not quite a moan. Something between the two, the sound of a human animal encountering something its evolutionary history had not prepared it for. I spent the night in the cargo bay, not by choice, by necessity. The rain had intensified and I could hear it hitting the hull in a continuous hiss, like fat on a hot surface, and I did not want to be outside while it did what it was doing. I did not sleep. I sat with my back against the inner wall of the cargo bay and I stared at the darkness where the crew compartment was, and I listened. For what I did not know, for the thing that had made those skins, for the sound of something moving inside a dead vehicle, for the subtle wet noise that a boneless human casing might make if it shifted in its seat. I heard nothing. The silence of the ash wastes pressed in through the torn hull and filled the space around me with its oppressive chemical weight. And I sat in it, and I waited for morning, which came not as dawn, but as a gradual, imperceptible lightening of the gloom that might have been sunrise or might have been a shift in the density of the overcast. I left the wreck without looking back at the crew compartment. I did not want to see if the skins had moved. The second discovery came 6 hours later, and it was worse because it was alive. I heard them before I saw them. A sound like nothing I had ever encountered. Clicking. Rapid, rhythmic, overlapping clicking, as though a dozen people were snapping their fingers in complex, coordinated patterns. The sound came from ahead and slightly to my left, moving through the mist at a pace that suggested walking. I stopped. I crouched. Underhive instincts. Make yourself small, make yourself quiet, assess the threat before it assesses you. The clicking grew louder, closer, and then out of the mist they came. I will not call them people. That word implies something that I am not certain applied to them. They were human-shaped, yes, bipedal, upright, approximately the correct proportions for adult humans, but their bodies were wrong in ways that my vocabulary struggled to articulate even then, and struggles now. They were encased in metal, not armor, not in the way I understood armor, not plates strapped to a body for protection. This was more intimate, more fundamental. The metal was part of them. It grew from them, or they had grown into it, or the distinction between the two had been erased so long ago that it no longer mattered. Tubes ran in and out of their torsos, connecting to canisters mounted on their backs. And through the tubes I could see liquid moving, dark and viscous, pumped by mechanisms that clicked with each cycle. That was the sound. The clicking. It was their circulation, their blood, or whatever had replaced their blood, being moved through their bodies by mechanical pumps that ticked and snapped with every heartbeat. Their faces were the worst part. They had faces, technically. There was a forward-facing arrangement of features on each head that corresponded roughly to the human standard: 2 visual sensors, a respiratory intake, a communicative aperture. But the features were recessed behind layers of filtration equipment, tubes and valves, and membranes that obscured everything beneath. And what little I could see of the actual flesh was the gray-brown color of cured leather. They were breathing the ash-waste atmosphere without distress. Their lungs, or whatever they had instead of lungs, were processing the toxic air through the filtration systems integrated into their bodies, and the waste products were being expelled through vents in their backs in small, periodic puffs of dark vapor. They had adapted, not in the biological sense, not through generations of mutation and natural selection, but through engineering. Someone at some point had taken human beings and rebuilt them for this environment, or they had rebuilt themselves, piece by piece, replacement by replacement, over decades or centuries, until what remained was a machine that remembered being human and expressed that memory through the shape of its silhouette, and nothing else. There were 9 of them. They stopped when they saw me. The clicking did not stop. It could not stop. It was autonomic, as involuntary as a heartbeat, but everything else about them went still. 9 figures standing in the mist, their filtration systems hissing softly, their pump hearts clicking in a syncopation that was almost musical, regarding me through lenses that were not eyes. I stood. There did not seem to be any point in crouching. They had seen me. Whatever was going to happen regardless of my posture. What happened was nothing. They looked at me. I looked at them. The mist moved between us. Then the one at the front, the tallest of them, slightly broader across the shoulders than the others, with a pump heart that clicked at a lower frequency, raised one hand. The hand was metal. Not a cybernetic replacement, not the kind of crude augmetic that underhive fighters sometimes bolted onto stumps after losing digits in brawls. This was a hand that had been designed as a hand, with fingers that moved with fluid, mechanical precision, each joint articulating independently, each digit tipped with a sensor pad that was either organic or a convincing imitation of organic. The hand rose, palm outward. A gesture, a universal gesture. I come in peace, or possibly stop. Or possibly I am showing you that I am not holding a weapon. The meaning was ambiguous, but the intent was clear. Communication. I raised my hand in return. My hand was flesh and bone, scarred and calloused and stained with the chemical residue of the ash waste, and it looked pathetic next to the engineered precision of theirs. But I raised it. The tall one made a sound, not a word, a series of clicks produced not by the pump heart, but by something in the throat, a deliberate, controlled sequence of sharp sounds that carried information in their pattern, if not in their phonetics. The others responded with their own clicks, a cascading exchange that lasted perhaps 5 seconds and conveyed more meaning than I could parse. Then the tall one turned and began walking. The others followed. And because I had nowhere else to go, and because they had not killed me, and because being around other living things, even things that were only questionably living, was better than being alone in the chemical mist with the memory of empty skins draped over transport seats, I followed them. They moved with purpose. That was the first thing I noticed. Where my walking had been directionless, a straight line into nothing, theirs was navigated. They knew where they were going. They read the waste the way I read the underhive, with an intimate familiarity born of years of survival in an environment that was trying to kill them. They changed direction based on subtle cues I could not perceive, shifts in the color or density of the mist, changes in the texture of the ground crust, sounds too quiet or too high-pitched for my unmodified ears to detect. They walked around things I could not see. They paused at intervals that seemed random to me but that I later understood were coordinated with changes in wind patterns, waiting for toxic gusts to pass before resuming movement. And they did all of this in silence, communicating through clicks that I was beginning to recognize as a language, a complete and functional language of percussive sounds that required no breath, no vocal cords, no moving lips. Just the mechanical precision of engineered throat structures producing rapid-fire sequences of information. I walked with them for what I estimated was half a day before we reached their camp. Camp is the wrong word. Settlement is wrong too. Nest might be closer, though it implies a comfort that was not present. What they had built was a structure. A low, partially buried dome of salvaged metal and hardened ash paste, pressed into a natural depression in the waste where a slight overhang of compacted residue provided some shelter from the acid rain. Inside, it was warm. Not warm in the way the underhive was warm, the stuffy, recycled warmth of bodies packed too tightly in spaces too small. This was a clean warmth, a dry warmth, generated by thermal exchange units that tapped into heat radiating from deep below the surface, piping it up through coils that ran through the walls of the dome and radiated it inward. The floor was smooth, the air was filtered. It was, in its austere and mechanical way, the most comfortable place I had been since leaving the hive. They gave me water, not the brown, metallic-tasting recycled water of the underhive. Clear water, cold. I drank it without caution, too thirsty for suspicion, and it tasted like nothing, like the absence of taste, like water that had never been through a body, never been filtered through kidneys, never been reclaimed from sweat and urine and processed back into something technically potable but experientially unpleasant. It was the best thing I had ever tasted, and it tasted like nothing. There is something in that paradox that I think says something important about me and about the life I had lived, but I am not equipped to articulate what it is. The tall one sat across from me. In the filtered light of the dome's interior, I could see more detail. The metal that covered the body was not uniform. It was layered, built up over time, newer components welded or bonded over older ones, creating a stratigraphy of modification that told a history in metallurgy. The oldest layers, visible in places where the newer ones had worn thin, were crude. Rough castings, uneven surfaces, visible seam lines. The newer layers were refined, smoother, better fitted. As though the art of self-modification had improved over generations, each iteration learning from the last, each new modification slightly more sophisticated than what it replaced. The pump heart was visible through a transparent panel in the chest, a fist-sized mechanical organ that contracted and expanded with the clicking rhythm I had been hearing since I first encountered them in the mist. Inside the pump, I could see the dark liquid moving. Not blood. Something heavier, something that caught the light with an oily iridescence. The tall one reached toward my face. I flinched. It stopped. Waited. Reached again, more slowly. I did not flinch the second time. A metal finger, warm from internal heating, touched my cheek, pressed gently, moved along my jaw, my neck, my collarbone. It was not an examination. It was not a threat. It was curiosity. The same curiosity I would show toward an animal I had never seen before. What are you made of? How do you work? What keeps you alive in a place like this? The finger withdrew. The tall one made a series of clicks, quieter than before. The others, arranged around the dome's interior in postures that might have been sitting or might have been a mechanical equivalent of sitting, responded with their own clicks. A discussion. About me. I pointed at my chest, then at my mouth. Then I spoke. My voice was a ruin. 2 days of breathing corrosive air had shredded my vocal cords, and what came out was a rasping whisper that barely qualified as speech. I said my name. They did not react. I said it again. Nothing. Names meant nothing to them. Language meant nothing to them, at least not my language, not the guttural, low-Gothic pidgin of the underhive, full of slang and profanity and words that only made sense if you understood the specific miseries they described. I stopped trying to speak. We sat in the warm silence of the dome, the pump hearts clicking around me in their overlapping rhythms, and I understood that I had found something I did not expect to find in the ash wastes. Not safety. Not companionship, something more unsettling than either. I had found people who had solved the problem of living out here, and the solution was to stop being human. I stayed with them. I want to say I chose to stay, but choice implies alternatives, and I had none. The ash wastes in every direction offered nothing but slow dissolution. The hive behind me was sealed. The Nomads, as I came to think of them, because I needed to call them something and they offered no name for themselves, were the only option that did not end in death, and even that was uncertain. They tolerated me. That is the most accurate word. They did not welcome me. They did not embrace me. They did not integrate me into their clicking conversations or their routines. They tolerated me the way you might tolerate a stray animal that has followed you home, with a kind of detached curiosity and occasional impersonal kindness. They fed me. They sheltered me. They watched me with their lens eyes and clicked about me in their mechanical language, and I existed among them without being one of them. On the third day, one of the Nomads did something different. It was smaller than the others, narrower across the shoulders, with modifications that looked newer, less layered, as though the process had begun more recently. It approached me while the others were performing their maintenance rituals, and it stood very close, closer than any of them had stood before, and it looked at me with its lens eyes for a long time. Then it raised its metal hand and made a gesture. Not a click. Not the open palm greeting the tall one had used. It pressed 3 fingers against its own chest, then pointed at me, then pressed 3 fingers again. 3. The number 3. The sulfur teeth used 3s as a signal. 3 knocks to request entry to the water treatment facility. 3 short whistles to call a retreat. 3 taps on a pipe to say, "I am here. I am alive. I am one of yours." No one outside the crew knew the 3s. No one except us. I looked at this mechanical creature, at the tubes and the valves and the metal casing where a face should have been, and I tried to find Draenor in there somewhere. I tried to find the woman with a face like a clenched fist and a voice that could make grown men weep. The woman who had told me to shut my mouth about the warm walls in the passage. The woman who had disappeared from the underhive 8 months before my exile. Vanished, we assumed. Killed, probably. Fed into the corpse-starch processor, certainly. But she had not been killed. She had been exiled, the same as me. And she had found the same nomads, and she had made the same choice. And now she stood in front of me in a body that was no longer hers, making the only gesture she still remembered from a life that no longer existed. 3 fingers, 3 taps. I am here. I am alive. I am one of yours. She could not speak. She had no voice. Whatever the modification did to the throat, it removed the capacity for human speech and replaced it with the clicking apparatus, and you cannot say someone's name in clicks. But she remembered. Somewhere inside the metal and the tubes and the dark fluid that had replaced her blood, she remembered. I reached out and pressed 3 fingers against my own chest. She stood still for a long moment, then she turned and walked away, her pump heart clicking at a rhythm that might have been faster than normal, or might have been exactly the same as always, because I was not yet calibrated to tell the difference. The dome was not their only structure. Over the following days, as my lungs slowly adapted to the filtered air inside, and my voice clawed its way back from the edge of permanent ruin, I discovered that they had an entire settlement. Not large, not by any standard that a hive dweller would recognize as significant. 8 domes connected by enclosed tunnels that ran just below the surface of the crust, housing perhaps 40 individuals in total. The settlement was invisible from above, deliberately so. The domes were covered in a layer of ash paste that made them indistinguishable from the surrounding waste, and the tunnel entrances were concealed behind natural-looking formations that were, in fact, carefully engineered camouflage. They were hiding. From what I did not initially know, it was in the 6th dome, the smallest and most distant from the central hub, that I found the skins. I had been exploring the settlement's periphery, mapping it in my mind the way I had mapped the underhive's corridors when I pushed aside a curtain of treated hide and entered a space that stopped me dead. They were hanging from the ceiling, dozens of them. Human skins, complete and intact, suspended from hooks on thin metal wires, swaying almost imperceptibly in the dome's filtered air currents. They were identical to the ones I had found in the cargo hauler. The same papery dryness, the same perfect completeness, the same uncanny preservation of every detail, every wrinkle, every pore. But these were not old. Some of them were fresh, supple, still carrying the faintest trace of color in the cheeks, the faintest suggestion of moisture around the lips. The nomads had collected them, or recovered them, or both. The tall one found me standing among the hanging skins, staring at one that still had its eyes, clouded but intact, gazing at nothing from a face that had been emptied of everything behind it. The tall one clicked a short sequence and pointed at the dome's entrance, then at the waste beyond, then back at the skins. A warning. The organism did this. The thing beneath the ash waste, when it encountered unprotected organic matter on its territory, did not simply consume it whole. It extracted. It hollowed. It took what it needed, the biomass, the protein, the minerals and fluids, and everything that constituted the interior of a living body, and it left the exterior behind, discarded like packaging, like the skin of a fruit after the flesh has been eaten. The nomads' mechanical bodies protected them. The metal and the tubes and the dark fluid that replaced their blood were not organic. The organism could not hollow them the way it hollowed flesh. That was the modification's true purpose. Not to survive the air, not to filter the toxins, to become inedible, to become something the organism's feeding mechanisms could not grip, could not penetrate, could not extract from. The nomads had not merely adapted to the ash wastes, they had armored themselves against being eaten alive, and the skins hanging in the sixth dome were the evidence of what happened to those who walked the wastes without that armor. I asked the question with my eyes, the only question that mattered to me at that moment, the question of why I was still alive. The tall one seemed to understand. It clicked a short response and gestured broadly, sweeping its metal hand across the horizon, then pointed downward at the ground beneath the dome, then made a pinching motion, bringing its fingers together. The organism was not everywhere. Not yet. It was concentrated, dense around the feeding depressions and the shadow of the spire, thinner in the open waste between zones, absent entirely in some stretches where the ash crust was deep enough and barren enough that there was nothing for it to anchor to. I had walked through the gaps. I had been lucky, or the organism had been dormant enough during my transit that its feeding mechanisms were inactive in the regions I crossed. The wreck's crew had not been lucky. They had stopped in the wrong place, or for too long, or too close to something beneath the surface that was hungry enough to reach upward through the crust and take what it needed. I learned through observation. I could not speak their language, and they could not or would not speak mine, so everything I understood about them came from watching, from following, from being present in their spaces and paying attention to what they did. They had routines. Every aspect of their existence was structured around routines so precise that they bordered on ritual. The pump hearts were serviced every third day, each individual opening the transparent panel in their chest and allowing another to inspect the mechanism, adjusting tension on springs, replacing seals, adding fluid from sealed containers that were stored in the deepest dome. The filtration systems in their faces were cleaned daily, membranes rinsed in a solution that smelled sharply of something astringent, valves tested by running measured volumes of air through them, and listening to the pitch of the resulting whistle. Everything was maintenance, everything was upkeep. Their bodies were machines, and machines require care. And the care of those machines was the central activity around which all other activities were organized. But there was another routine, one I did not understand for a long time, and when I did understand it, I wished I had not. Every 7 days, by my rough estimation, a group of 4 would leave the settlement. Always 4. Always the same 4. Or at least I believed they were the same 4, though distinguishing individuals among the Nomads was difficult given how much of their original features were obscured by modification. They would leave through the eastern tunnel, the one that led to a concealed exit about 200 meters from the nearest dome, and they would not return for approximately 16 hours. When they came back, they were carrying things, containers, heavy sealed containers made of a material I did not recognize, something that was neither metal nor ceramic nor plastic, but had qualities of all three. The containers were always warm, not hot, but distinctly warm, as though their contents were generating heat. And the contents were always the same, though I did not discover this until the 5th or 6th excursion, when curiosity overcame caution and I followed the 4 out through the eastern tunnel. They did not stop me. I think they expected it. I think they had been waiting for me to follow, had been watching my growing restlessness, my increasing habit of hovering near the eastern tunnel when the 4 prepared to leave, my obvious and pathetically transparent interest in where they went and what they carried back. They let me come. They did not slow down for me, and keeping pace with them across the open waste was difficult because they moved with the tireless, mechanical efficiency of bodies that did not fatigue the way flesh does, but they did not try to lose me either. We walked east. The mist was thin that day, visibility perhaps 50 meters, and for the first time since my exile, I could see the broader landscape of the ash waste. It was not as featureless as I had believed. There were formations, ridges and depressions and occasional outcroppings of compacted residue that rose from the crust like the exposed spines of buried structures. Some of them were buried structures. I could see edges of metal protruding from the ash, the corners of buildings or the surfaces of roadways that had been buried by millennia of waste accumulation. The ash waste was not empty. It was full. Full of everything the hive had ever produced and discarded and forgotten, compressed and covered and slowly dissolving beneath the surface. We walked for perhaps 4 hours. The terrain changed. The flat crust gave way to a region of shallow depressions, each one roughly circular, each one perhaps 20 meters across, arranged in a pattern that was not random. The depressions were darker than the surrounding waste. The material at their centers was not the gray compacted ash of the general surface, but something softer, darker, almost black, with a consistency that I would describe as organic, if that word did not seem so wildly out of place in this environment. The 4 nomads slowed, their clicking intensified, a rapid exchange that sounded urgent, purposeful. And then they did something that made my skin contract against my bones, with a revulsion I still feel when I recall it. They opened the containers. Inside each one was meat, not processed, not the corpse-starch or fungal protein of the underhive. Raw meat, red-brown, glistening, cut into chunks the size of a man's head. The first time I saw it, I could not identify the source, could not tell if it was human or animal or something else entirely, and I did not want to identify it. I maintained that willful blindness for 3 more feeding excursions before the truth forced itself upon me with the subtlety of a fist. The nomads did not hunt. There was nothing to hunt in the ash wastes. No animals, no mutant beasts, no fauna of any kind. The organism beneath the surface had consumed every competing biological entity centuries ago. And the nomads did not trade with the hive. They had no contact with the hive. The meat came from one source, and that source walked itself to the settlement's doorstep with the regularity of a tithe. Exiles. The hive expelled them on a schedule that I had not noticed until the nomads showed me. Every few weeks, the exile door opened and another human being staggered onto the corroded platform and climbed down the ladder and wandered into the mist. Most of them died. The organism found them, and the hollowing process left nothing the nomads could use as food. But some of them found the nomads the way I had found the nomads, through luck or stubbornness or the blind momentum of a body that refuses to stop walking. And the nomads offered those survivors the same choice they had offered me, the modification, the transformation, the needle and the cold fluid, and the slow surrender of flesh. Some accepted, some could not. The ones who were too broken, too far gone, too damaged in body or mind to survive the process, the nomads gave a different mercy. A quick, painless cessation, administered with the same mechanical precision they brought to everything else. And the bodies, the fresh, complete, organic bodies that the modification's chemistry could not use, went into the containers. It was not murder, it was not cruelty. It was the most terrible form of pragmatism I had ever encountered. The organism needed to be fed. The dead were already dead. And the alternative, letting the organism go unfed, letting the chemical signals build, letting the hive above descend into induced violence that would kill thousands, was worse. So much worse that the nomads had built an entire moral framework around the lesser evil, a clicking, wordless ethics of managed horror, and they performed their duty without hesitation and without pleasure, and without any of the self-deception that would have made it bearable. The 4 nomads carried the containers to the edge of the nearest depression and tipped the contents in. The meat tumbled down the shallow slope and came to rest at the dark center, and for a moment nothing happened. The waste was still. The mist was still. Even the clicking of the nomads' pump hearts seemed to quiet, as though every mechanical system in their bodies had simultaneously entered a lower power state, conserving energy, minimizing sound. Waiting. The ground moved, not dramatically, not the explosive eruption of something bursting from concealment. a slow tidal movement, a shifting of the dark material at the center of the depression, a displacement that suggested something very large moving just below the surface with the patience of something that had learned over enormous spans of time that patience was more efficient than speed. The meat disappeared. Not quickly, not with the violent snap of jaws closing or the wet sound of flesh being torn. It sank. It was absorbed. It descended into the dark material as though the surface were not solid but liquid, a thick, viscous liquid that drew the meat downward through surface tension alone. And within 30 seconds, every piece was gone, and the dark center was smooth and undisturbed once more. And the only evidence that anything had happened was the absence of what had been there. The Nomads repeated this at 3 more depressions, same procedure. Same unhurried waiting, same slow tidal absorption, same clicking, low and quiet, almost reverential. They were feeding something, something that lived beneath the ash waste, something that was large enough that its feeding sites were spaced dozens of meters apart, something so integrated into the landscape that the surface of the waste itself was part of its body. And the Nomads were not afraid of it. They served it. They carried food to it with the diligence and regularity of temple acolytes performing a sacred duty, and the clicking they made while they waited for the food to be absorbed had the cadence and structure of prayer. I should have run. That is what you are thinking, and you are right. And I knew it at the time, and I did not run, because running required a destination, and I did not have one. I stood at the edge of one of those depressions, and I watched the ground eat, and I understood that the ash wastes were not what I had believed them to be. They were not a wasteland. They were not an empty, inhospitable void between hive cities. They were inhabited, occupied, owned in a way that was more fundamental and more complete than any territorial claim any underhive gang had ever made. Something lived here. Something vast, something that the Nomads understood and I did not, something they had built their entire existence around serving, something that their mechanical bodies and their clicking language and their precise routines were all oriented toward sustaining. I wanted to ask them what it was. I wanted to grab the tall one by the shoulders and shake until an answer fell out, to demand in the guttural, profane pidgin of the underhive that they tell me what lived under the ground and why they fed it, and what it would do when it was done being fed. But I could not speak their language and they could not speak mine, and the distance between us was not one of vocabulary but of comprehension. They understood something I did not. They had made peace with something I could not yet perceive, and so I followed them back to the settlement in silence, walking in the wake of their clicking conversation, carrying the weight of what I had seen in a part of my mind that I did not want to visit but could not avoid. The tunnels were the next revelation. I found them by accident, or by the accumulated pressure of curiosity and fear that masquerades as accident in retrospect. The settlement had a 9th dome. I had counted 8 during my early exploration, but there was a 9th, deeper than the others, accessed through a tunnel that descended at a steep angle from the lowest point of the central dome. The entrance was not concealed from me, but neither was it obvious. It was simply there, an opening in the floor that the Nomads used regularly, but that I had not noticed because I had not been looking for it. Because in the underhive you learn to focus on horizontal space, on corridors and rooms and the flat plane of human habitation, and you forget that the world has a vertical axis too. I went down. The tunnel was different from the others. The connecting tunnels between domes were engineered, cut, and reinforced with salvaged material, lined with insulation and wiring. This tunnel was organic. The walls were smooth, not with the smoothness of worked metal or polished stone, but with the smoothness of the inside of a throat. The surface had a texture that was uniform and faintly ridged, like tissue, and when I touched it, it was warm. Not warm from external heating. warm from within. The tunnel was alive. Whatever material it was made of was biological, a tube of organic matter bored through the compacted ash and the sediment beneath, and the warmth I felt was the warmth of a living system, of metabolism, of cellular activity generating heat as a byproduct of existence. The tunnel went deeper than I expected, much deeper. The descent was gradual but continuous, and as I moved downward, the character of the walls changed. The ridged texture became more pronounced, the warmth increased. The surface became moist, not wet but damp, the kind of dampness that you find on the inside of a living creature's body, the condensation of biological processes occurring just beneath the surface. I could hear something, not the clicking of the Nomads, something lower, deeper. A vibration more felt than heard, a bass thrum that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the organic tissue that surrounded me. A pulse, a heartbeat, not the rapid ticking of a pump heart. A slow, enormous pulse, so deep and so vast that each beat took several seconds to complete. A rhythm that suggested a circulatory system on a scale I could not comprehend. The tunnel opened into a chamber. I am going to describe this chamber as accurately as I can, but I want to acknowledge up front that accuracy and comprehension are not the same thing, and that while I can tell you what I saw, I cannot guarantee that what I saw corresponded to what was actually there, because my mind was processing information through perceptual frameworks that were not designed for what I was perceiving. The chamber was large, very large. The ceiling was high enough that the bioluminescent glow emanating from the walls, a pale green light produced by organisms or compounds embedded in the organic tissue, did not fully illuminate it, leaving the upper reaches in shadow. The floor was the same warm, damp organic material as the tunnel walls, but here it was textured differently. Instead of ridges, there were structures, protrusions, shapes that rose from the floor like stalagmites in a cave, but that were not mineral formations. They were organs. I do not know what kind of organs. I do not have the biological vocabulary to describe them. They were the size of storage tanks, translucent, filled with fluid that moved in slow currents visible through their membranes, connected to the floor and to each other by networks of tubular structures that pulsed with the same deep, slow heartbeat I had felt in the tunnel. The chamber was inside something, not a cave, not a structure, a body. I was standing inside the body of something alive, something so large that it had chambers and organs and circulatory systems, something that extended beneath the ash waste in directions and dimensions I could not map, something whose heartbeat I could feel through the soles of my boots and whose breath I could taste in the warm, humid air of the chamber. There was a smell. I have avoided talking about smells because the ash waste had, by this point, burned out most of my olfactory sensitivity, but the chamber had a smell that was strong enough to register even through my damaged sinuses. It was not rot. It was not decay. It was the smell of living tissue, the warm, wet, copper-tinged scent of the inside of a body, of blood and membrane and the chemical processes of metabolism. It was the smell of the inside of a wound before infection sets in, that clean, raw, biological scent that tells you tissue is alive and functioning and doing what tissue does. In any other context, in a medici ward or a chirurgeon's table, the smell would have been clinical, professional, associated with healing and repair. Here, standing in a chamber that was itself a living organ, inside a creature whose dimensions exceeded my capacity for spatial reasoning, it was the smell of something else entirely. It was the smell of being inside something that was alive, in a way that nothing I had ever encountered was alive. Not the small, fragile, temporary aliveness of human bodies that broke down and failed and died after a few decades of punishing use. An aliveness that was foundational, planetary, an aliveness that had been continuous for millennia and showed no signs of interruption. that regenerated and expanded and adapted with the slow confidence of something that existed on a timescale that made human civilization look like an afternoon. I stood in that chamber and I felt, for the first time in my life, truly small. Not the smallness of being under hive scum, not the social smallness of being at the bottom of a hierarchy so vast that the people at the top could not be distinguished from myth. A physical smallness, a biological smallness, the smallness of a bacterium on the skin of something immense, existing in a world defined by surfaces and textures and local chemistry while being completely unable to comprehend the shape and purpose of the body it inhabited. I touched one of the organs. I do not know why. The same compulsion that had made me touch the skins in the cargo hauler. Perhaps the need to confirm through contact what the eyes refused to believe. My palm pressed flat against the translucent membrane, and the surface was warm and yielding and alive in a way that made my hand want to jerk back, but I held it there, and then something happened that I cannot explain in any language I possess. I saw something, not with my eyes, with something deeper, something behind my eyes, something in the part of the brain that processes images during sleep. A flash, a moment, a fragment of someone else's life projected into my awareness with the vividness and specificity of a memory that was not mine. I was standing in a corridor, a hive corridor, bright with lumen strips crowded with people in workers' coveralls, the air thick with the smell of processed protein and machine oil. A woman was holding my hand. Not my hand, someone else's hand. Someone who had lived and died and been consumed and broken down into chemical components and absorbed into the organism's biomass centuries ago, but whose neural imprint had been preserved, somehow, in the biological substrate of the organ I was touching. The memory lasted less than a second. The woman's face was clear. Her eyes were brown. She was smiling. Then it was gone, and I was standing in a chamber inside a living creature beneath the ash wastes, and my hand was shaking so badly against the membrane that the fluid inside the organ was rippling. The organism remembered, not consciously, not with intent. But the biological processes that broke down consumed tissue preserved some fraction of the neural chemistry, the molecular echoes of experience encoded in the same proteins and lipids that the organism was digesting. Thousands of years of consumed lives, millions of people, their final moments, and their deepest memories, and their most vivid experiences, all reduced to chemical traces suspended in the fluids of organs I could not name, accessible to anyone foolish enough to touch the membrane and complete the circuit. It was not a mind. It was not awareness. It was a library written in the language of decomposed neurons, and every entry was someone who had lived and loved and feared and died and been fed to the thing beneath the hive, and their echo persisted in the dark, warm fluid, a ghost of chemistry, a memory of a memory, forever. The Nomads were there, not the 4 who had fed the depressions. Others, a dozen of them, perhaps more, moving among the organ structures with practiced familiarity, their clicking muted and synchronized, working, maintaining. They were tending to the organs the way they tended to their own pump hearts, checking membranes, adjusting flow rates in the tubular connections by squeezing or releasing pinch valves made of the same organic material as everything else in the chamber, monitoring, caring for something, keeping it alive, keeping it healthy, keeping it fed. One of them saw me. The clicking stopped. All of it. Every nomad in the chamber went still, their pump hearts the only sound, and in the silence I could hear the deep pulse of the thing beneath me with terrible clarity. The tall one was there. It approached me with the same deliberate, non-threatening pace it had used when we first met in the mist. It stopped in front of me. It raised its metal hand, and then it did something it had not done before. It pointed, down, through the floor, into the depths beneath us, into whatever lay below this chamber, below this organ space, below everything I could see or sense or imagine. It pointed down and it clicked, a single sequence of sounds repeated twice, and though I did not speak their language, I understood the message with a clarity that was physical, that bypassed my ears and my brain and landed directly in my stomach. It is bigger than this. What you are seeing is not all of it. What you are seeing is not even a meaningful fraction of it. You are inside something, and the something you are inside is inside something else, and that something else extends in every direction further than you can conceive. And it is alive, and it is growing, and it has been here longer than the hive above it. And the hive above it is not a city built by humans to shelter humans. The hive is something else. The hive has always been something else. The place they called the shadow of the spire was not a place in any conventional sense. It was a condition, a zone where the hive's presence above created effects on the waste below that were different from the surrounding terrain, where the thermal output of the hive's lower manufactoria met the chemical composition of the surface and produced something that existed nowhere else. I walked there with the tall Nomad 3 days after my descent into the chamber, and what I found there dismantled the last remaining structures of my understanding of the world I had lived in for 31 years. The shadow of the spire was, at its most basic description, a dumping ground. A vast depression in the ash crust, perhaps a kilometer across, where the hive's biological waste was expelled through massive outflow pipes that protruded from the base of the structure like the severed stumps of ancient limbs. The waste was organic, all of it. Bodies, parts of bodies, the byproducts of the corpse-starch production facilities that operated on the lower mid-levels, the material that was too degraded or too contaminated even for the hive's indiscriminate recycling systems, failed organ harvests from the biologist labs, rejected tissue cultures, amniotic fluid from the vat-borne breeding programs that supplied the hive's workforce with a steady stream of expendable labor. All of it pumped and dumped and expelled into this depression in a continuous, never-ending flow that had been running for centuries, possibly millennia, creating a lake of biological matter that should, by any rational assessment, have been the most toxic and uninhabitable location on the planet's surface. It was not toxic, it was alive. The surface of the depression moved, not with the agitation of decay, not the bubbling and heaving of decomposition gases pushing through liquefying tissue. With purpose, with direction, currents flowed across the surface in patterns that were too regular to be random, spiraling inward toward the center of the depression in a slow, deliberate vortex that drew the incoming biological waste toward a central point and then downward, down into whatever lay beneath. The color was wrong for dead matter. It was not the gray-brown of decomposition or the black of putrefaction. It was a deep, almost luminous red-purple, the color of oxygenated blood seen through tissue, the color of something alive and metabolically active and feeding. This was not a dump, it was a mouth. One of many mouths, I realized, each of those dark depressions in the waste where the Nomads deposited their offerings was a feeding site, but this was the primary intake, the main point of ingestion, the place where the organism beneath the ash waste consumed the most and grew the fastest and pushed its boundaries outward with the slow, inexorable pressure of something that had time on its side and used it with a certainty that made human lifespans look like the blinking of an eye. The tall Nomad led me around the perimeter of the depression. The ground was unstable here, the crust thinner, the organic substrate closer to the surface. In places, I could see it through cracks in the ash layer, that same warm, ridged tissue I had encountered in the tunnels. But here it was thicker, denser, threaded with vascular structures that were visible as dark lines beneath the translucent surface, pulsing with that slow, enormous heartbeat. The organism was not just beneath the waste. It was the waste, or it had become the waste, or the waste had become it, or the distinction between organism and environment had been erased over the centuries of continuous feeding until the two were a single system, an ecology of one, a living entity that had consumed and incorporated its surroundings until it was indistinguishable from them. The tall Nomad brought me to a structure on the far side of the depression. Unlike everything else in the ash wastes, this structure was clearly human-made. Not Nomad-made, not improvised from salvage and ash paste. This was engineered, precise, built with tools and materials and expertise that spoke of institutional resources, of organized effort, of the backing of an entity far more powerful than any underhive gang or guilder cartel. The structure was partially buried, sunk into the ash by centuries of accumulation, but its upper portion was still exposed. A low, rectangular building with walls of reinforced ceramite, still bearing traces of markings that the corrosive environment had not quite managed to erase. I could make out fragments, a symbol, a cog within the cog, a shape that might have been a helix, the double spiral of genetic material that I recognized from the medical primers distributed in the underhive by administratum, health officers who visited once a decade and achieved nothing. The symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, specifically the symbol of the Biologis division. The janitors, the flesh tinkerers, the priests of the machine god who worshipped not metal but meat. The door was open, not forced, not broken, open, as though it had been left open deliberately, or had never been closed, or had been designed to remain open as part of a function I did not understand. Inside was a laboratory, or what had once been a laboratory. The equipment was still there, covered in ash and the accumulated grime of centuries, but structurally intact. Built to last by people who understood that their work might need to outlive them by a very long time. Cogitator banks lined the walls, their screens dead, their machine spirits silent, but their housings unbreached. Examination tables, adjustable, fitted with restraints that were designed for subjects significantly larger than a human being. Storage units containing sealed containers, their contents hidden behind opaque walls, but their labels still partially legible. I could read some of them. My literacy was functional, the basic low Gothic that every underhive worker learned in order to follow safety instructions and fill out labor requisitions. The labels contained words I recognized and words I did not. Specimen, culture, substrate, viable, caution, words that meant things in isolation but that, assembled in the context of this abandoned laboratory overlooking a kilometer-wide pool of living biological waste, assembled into a meaning that I did not want to understand but could not avoid understanding. The servitor was in the back room. I almost missed it. It was sitting in a recessed alcove behind one of the cogitator banks, connected to the wall by a thick bundle of cables that ran from the base of its skull into a junction port. It was not dead. That was the first thing I registered, the small, rhythmic movement of its chest, the faint hum of whatever internal power source kept its augmented systems running after all these centuries. It was ancient. The biological components that remained, a portion of the torso, the lower half of the face, one eye, were preserved in a state of suspended decay, skin the color and texture of old leather stretched over reinforced bone. The mechanical components were Mechanicus standard, heavy and functional and utterly without aesthetic consideration, designed to last indefinitely and apparently succeeding in that design. It was a monitoring unit, a watcher, Left here by the Magi biologists when they departed, tasked with a single function, observing the experiment and transmitting data to a forge world designated by a code I could not decipher. It was still doing its job. The single biological eye tracked me as I moved through the laboratory, following my position with the dull, autonomic attention of a system that registered stimuli but did not process them into meaning. Its mouth moved occasionally, forming words in a sub-vocal murmur that I could not hear, but that the cogitator behind it presumably could, dictating observations into a recording apparatus that had been running continuously for millennia. It knew everything. Every phase of the organism's growth, every expansion of its biomass, every shift in its chemical output, every year that the equilibrium between feeding and dormancy had grown more precarious. All of it recorded, all of it transmitted, and none of it acted upon because the servitor had not been programmed to act. It had been programmed to watch and report, and somewhere across the void, on a forge world that might no longer exist, in an archive that might never be read, the complete history of the organism's transformation from controlled experiment to planetary-scale threat was sitting in a data stack, gathering dust, waiting for someone who cared to retrieve it. No one had ever come. No one would ever come. The Mechanicus had built this thing, seeded it, monitored it, and then forgotten about it with the institutional indifference that was their greatest talent and their most consistent sin. This was where it started. This laboratory, this facility. Whatever was living beneath the ash wastes had not evolved here. It had not arrived from space. It had not crawled up from the planet's geological depths. It had been made, engineered, designed by Magi biologists in the service of the Adeptus Mechanicus, created in this laboratory or one very like it, using tools and techniques and knowledge that the Imperium's biological priesthood possessed and wielded with the same cold pragmatism that characterized everything the Mechanicus did. The organism was an experiment, a project, something that had been deliberately created, deliberately placed, deliberately fed, and the hive above it was part of the design. I need to say that again because the first time I thought it, my mind rejected it. And the second time I thought it, my mind tried to rationalize it. And the third time I thought it, something inside me, some last shred of the identity I had built as a hive dweller, as a citizen of Sulgreth, as a human being who had been born and raised inside a structure he believed existed to shelter and sustain human life, broke. The hive was not a city. The hive was not a fortress. The hive was not the accumulated achievement of human industry and human will and human endurance over countless generations of habitation. The hive was a feeding apparatus, a mechanism for converting raw materials, human beings, food, water, industrial output, biological waste, the dead and the dying and the discarded, into nutrients for the thing that lived beneath it. Everything the hive produced flowed downward. Everything. The waste from the manufactoria, the effluent from the hab blocks. The bodies of the dead ground into corpse-starch or expelled directly through the outflow pipes. The toxins, the chemicals, the pollutants that everyone assumed were simply the unfortunate byproducts of industry. All of it fed the organism. All of it was consumed. All of it was converted into biomass, into growth, into the slow, relentless expansion of something that had been eating for longer than anyone inside the hive could remember. The exiles, the people pushed through the doors. I thought of them. I thought of Getri with her broken legs, screaming as she fell. I thought of myself, walking into the burning air because the alternative was worse. We were not being punished. We were not being discarded. We were being fed. The exile doors were feeding tubes. The guilders, the enforcers, Overseer Brakuth, standing in his gilt-edged coat with his hand raised, pointing at the open door, They were not administrators of justice. They were functionaries in a feeding system, and they did not know it. That was the part that broke me. Not the horror of it, though the horror was immense. Not the scale, though the scale was incomprehensible. The fact that none of them knew. The Guilders enforced exile because it was tradition, because it was law, because it was what had always been done. They did not know that the tradition existed because the organism needed protein. The noble houses of the spire taxed and tithed and administered because that was how power worked, because that was what power did. They did not know that the entire structure of power, the entire hierarchy of the hive from the governor's palace in the highest spire to the deepest sump of the underhive, was a digestive system. The hive was a stomach. I had said that to myself on my first day outside, standing in the acid rain, watching my clothes dissolve. I had been more right than I knew. I searched the laboratory. I am not a scholar, I am not a tech adept. I cannot interface with cogitators or read the sacred binary of the Mechanicus. But there were physical records, data slates, some of them still functional, their screens flickering to life when I pressed the activation runes with fingers that were shaking so badly that I had to use both hands. The text was dense, technical, full of terminology I did not understand, but there were passages in plain Gothic, summaries and annotations written by someone who had wanted their work to be understood by non-specialists. Perhaps an overseer, perhaps an auditor, perhaps someone who had understood that the work being done here was important enough to document in language that laypeople could access. I read fragments. I read enough. The project was designated with a numerical code that I have forgotten because numbers that long do not stay in a mind like mine. But the project summary was clear. The organism was a bioreclamation system, designed to process industrial and organic waste in environments where conventional recycling infrastructure was insufficient or non-existent. The organism was engineered to consume biological waste, break it down into constituent chemical compounds, and excrete processed material that could be used as soil substrate, fertilizer, or raw chemical feedstock. It was designed to be self-sustaining, self-replicating, self-regulating. It was designed to grow in proportion to the waste it received, expanding its processing capacity as the waste volume increased, scaling automatically to match the output of whatever industrial or population center it was placed beneath. It was, on paper, an elegant solution to one of the Imperium's most persistent problems, the disposal of the astronomical quantities of waste produced by hive worlds with populations in the billions. The records did not say when it had been deployed. They did not say who had authorized its deployment. They did not say whether the hive above had been built before or after the organism was placed, though the implications of the facility's position at the base of the hive integrated into the hive's waste outflow infrastructure, connected to the hive's systems by pipes and ducts that were clearly original to the hive's construction rather than retrofitted, suggested an answer that made my stomach clench. The organism had not been placed beneath an existing hive. The hive had been built above an existing organism, or they had been built together, two components of a single system, the upper component producing waste and the lower component consuming it, neither one complete without the other, each one dependent on the other for its continued function. The hive needed the organism to dispose of its waste. The organism needed the hive to produce its food, a symbiosis, a partnership, a relationship that had been designed and implemented by people who understood exactly what they were creating and who had decided in the cold calculus of the Mechanicus that the benefits outweighed the costs. The costs. The records mentioned the costs, mentioned them in passing, in the dispassionate language of technical documentation, as parameters to be monitored rather than atrocities to be mourned. The organism was designed to be self-regulating, but self-regulation required feedback. The organism needed to know when it had enough food and when it needed more. The mechanism for this feedback was chemical. The organism released compounds into the surrounding environment that, when they reached sufficient concentration, induced behavioral changes in the population above. Increased aggression, increased reproduction, increased mortality, increased waste output. When the organism was hungry, it made the hive above it more violent, more fertile, more wasteful. When it was sated, the chemical signals diminished and the hive above calmed. The cycles of violence that defined underhive life, the gang wars, the famines, the plagues, the periodic eruptions of senseless brutality that everyone accepted as simply the nature of life in the lower levels were not natural. They were induced. They were the organism's appetite, expressed through the behavior of the population it was feeding on, amplified and modulated and fine-tuned over millennia of co-evolution until the feedback loop was so deeply embedded in the hive's social structure that no one could distinguish it from normal human behavior. I put down the data slate. I sat on the floor of the laboratory. I did not move for a long time. The tall Nomad stood in the doorway, clicking softly, watching me with its lens eyes, waiting for me to process what I had learned, waiting for me to understand what it already understood, what all of them understood, what their ancestors had understood when they had made the decision to leave the hive and live in the ash wastes, and modify their bodies and abandon their language and their names and their humanity rather than remain inside a structure that was not a home but a digestive organ. The Nomads were not primitives who had degenerated. They were refugees who had chosen this. They had chosen the corrosive air and the acid rain and the mechanical bodies and the clicking language over the alternative, over remaining inside the organism's feeding apparatus, over being food. They fed it because they had to. That was the part I understood last and wished I had understood first. The organism was a machine, a biological machine designed to perform a function, and it performed that function with the mindless efficiency of all machines. It consumed waste. It grew. It released chemical signals. It consumed more waste. It grew more. The cycle was automatic, self-perpetuating, and critically unstoppable. The organism could not be killed. It was too large, too distributed, too deeply integrated into the geological and industrial substrate of the planet to be destroyed by any means available to the people living above it. The Nomads had learned this. Their ancestors had tried. The records in the laboratory, if I read them correctly, documented at least 3 attempts to destroy or contain the organism, all failures, all resulting in the organism entering an accelerated growth phase as it responded to the damage by expanding faster, consuming more, growing back denser and more resilient than before. Hurting it made it hungrier. Starving it made it desperate. The only stable equilibrium was the one the Nomads had found, feeding it enough to keep it dormant, managing its appetite through regular, controlled inputs that satisfied its metabolic needs without triggering the chemical feedback loop that made the hive above more violent. The Nomads were not worshipping it. They were managing it. They were zookeepers tending to something that could not be released and could not be contained and could only, through constant, careful, unending effort, be kept from waking up completely. I spent the days after my discovery in the laboratory in a state that was not grief and was not rage and was not despair, but was something that contained elements of all 3 without committing to any of them. I walked through the settlement and I watched the Nomads perform their routines, and I thought about the underhive. I thought about the sulfur teeth, about Dranak, somewhere in this settlement now, clicking in the language of the thing she had become. About Vec and Tormund, the twins, who communicated in a pidgin so compressed that no one outside the crew could follow their conversations. about the fights we had fought and the territory we had held and the lives we had taken, and I wondered how many of those fights had been real. Had Dranik been angry because she was Dranik, or because the organism was hungry? Had the turf wars that killed half our crew been the natural consequence of too many people in too little space? Or had they been induced, cultivated like crops, harvested when they reached maturity? The organism did not need to understand human behavior. It simply released compounds, metabolic byproducts that happened by design, to interact with human neurochemistry in ways that increased the host population's output of consumable biological material. The elegance was obscene, the simplicity was monstrous, and the worst part was that it worked. It had been working since the hive was young. It would work until the hive was dust. The tall nomad showed me something else during those reflective days, something I have not mentioned yet because the memory of it is difficult to hold in my mind for long. In the deepest dome, the one I had initially overlooked, there was a wall. On the wall were marks, not writing, not symbols, tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched into the metal surface with tools that had varied over the centuries, from crude stone implements to precision-cut mechanical scribes. Each mark represented a generation. Each generation had added its own mark when it took over the role of managing the organism from the generation before. I tried to count them. I gave up after 200. The Nomads had been doing this for longer than most Imperial institutions had existed, longer than many planetary governments, longer than the memory of the Administratum, which supposedly recorded everything but in practice forgot whatever was not profitable to remember. 200 generations of modified humans living in the ash waste, breathing filtered poison, maintaining an organism they could not kill and dared not ignore, feeding it with the diligence of parents tending to a child that had never been theirs and would outlive them all by eons. And no one inside the hive knew. No one had ever known. The Nomads existed in the gap between the official record and the truth, performing a service that the Imperium would have called unsanctioned, and the Mechanicus would have called tech heresy, and the people of the hive would not have believed even if someone had stood in the middle of the deepest hab block and screamed it at the top of their lungs. But the equilibrium was failing. I could see it in the way the Nomads moved in the days after my visit to the laboratory. Their routines, previously so precise, so meticulously calibrated, became hurried. The feeding excursions increased from once every 7 days to once every 5, then every 4. The containers they carried were larger. The quantities of meat they deposited in the feeding depressions were greater, and the organism's response was changing. The slow, measured absorption that I had observed during my first feeding excursion was faster now, hungrier. The dark material at the centers of the depressions churned with a visible agitation that had not been there before, surface currents moving in patterns that were sharper, more urgent, less patient. The organism was waking up. After centuries, perhaps millennia of managed dormancy, of careful feeding and chemical equilibrium, something had changed. The organism was no longer satisfied with what it was being given. It wanted more. I do not know what triggered the change. The Nomads could not tell me, and the data slates in the laboratory, while comprehensive in their documentation of the project's early phases, contained nothing about long-term behavioral forecasting. Perhaps it was cumulative. Perhaps the organism had been growing fractionally beyond the Nomad's ability to manage for years or decades, each feeding cycle falling slightly short of what was needed, each shortfall compounding the next, building a deficit that had finally crossed a threshold. Perhaps the hive above had grown too, as hives always grow, each century adding population and industry and waste output, increasing the organism's food supply beyond what the Nomad's supplemental feeding could balance. Perhaps the organism had simply reached a size at which dormancy was no longer its default state, at which its metabolic needs exceeded what any feeding program could satisfy, at which the only option left was to feed itself. The first sign was the tremors. Small at first, a vibration in the floor of the domes that could have been mistaken for industrial resonance from the hive above or the settling of the ash crust beneath. But the Nomads did not mistake it. They felt it through their mechanical bodies, through the metal and the pump hearts and the tubes that connected them to each other and to the ground they stood on, and what they felt made them afraid. I did not know they could be afraid. I had not thought that their modification had left room for fear, that the mechanical replacement of so much of their biology had preserved the neurological capacity for that most human of responses. But they were afraid. I could hear it in their clicking, in the way the rhythms changed, becoming faster, more staccato, losing the measured cadence of their normal communication, and taking on a quality that needed no translation. The pump hearts accelerated. The filtration systems flared. Every mechanical body in the settlement was operating at heightened capacity, burning through their dark fluid at a rate that would require maintenance far sooner than their schedules allowed. The tremors grew. Over the course of 3 days, they went from subtle to significant, from a gentle hum felt through the soles of my boots to a rhythmic shuddering that made standing difficult and sleep impossible. The organism was moving, not the slow, tidal movement of feeding. This was different. This was structural. The biomass beneath the ash waste was shifting, rearranging, consolidating in ways that changed the surface above. New depressions appeared, the existing ones widened. The dark centers expanded, eating into the surrounding gray crust, dissolving the compacted ash from below and replacing it with that warm, living tissue. The organism was surfacing, not erupting, not attacking, surfacing, rising toward the light and the air with the same unhurried inevitability that had characterized its entire existence, growing upward because it had nowhere left to grow outward, its horizontal expansion having reached limits that I could not see, but that the tremors suggested were measured in kilometers. I went back to the edge of the shadow of the spire. I needed to see. The depression was larger, much larger. What had been a kilometer across was now closer to 2, the edges having advanced outward in a ring of dissolution that consumed the ash crust and left behind a surface of exposed organic tissue, glistening and pulsing and unmistakably alive. The outflow pipes from the hive were still pumping. The biological waste still flowed. But the organism was no longer waiting for the waste to reach it through the depression's central intake. It was rising to meet it. Tendrils of tissue, each one thicker than a man's body, had extended upward from the surface of the depression and attached themselves to the outflow pipes, wrapping around the metal with a grip that was not aggressive, but was absolute, fusing the organic and the industrial into a single system. The organism was connecting itself to the hive directly, bypassing the intermediary step of dumping and absorption. Plugging in, and it was climbing. I saw the tendrils on the hive's outer shell, low, near the base, in the area where the metal wall met the ash waste surface. Thin tendrils at first, creeping up the wall with a slowness that made them easy to dismiss, easy to mistake for discoloration or corrosion or the natural accumulation of organic residue on a surface that had been immersed in biological waste for millennia. But they were not residue. They were extensions of the organism, living tissue growing upward, following the seams and the joints and the maintenance channels of the hive's outer shell, finding every crack, every imperfection, every gap in the ancient ceramite and rockcrete, and pouring itself in. The organism was entering the hive, from below, through the foundations, through the spaces between walls, through the infrastructure, the pipes and ducts and conduits that ran through the hive's body like a nervous system, connecting every level to every other level, providing the pathways through which a patient, distributed, endlessly growing biological entity could spread itself from the lowest foundations to the highest spires without anyone inside noticing, until it was far too late to do anything about it. I thought about the people inside. I thought about the underhive, about sublevel 38, where I had slept in a decommissioned water treatment facility with 11 other people who called themselves the Sulfur Teeth, about the hab blocks above, where millions of people lived and worked and fought and died without ever knowing what was beneath their feet, without ever understanding that their entire existence was a chemical response induced by an organism that was using them as a food source. I thought about the children. There were always children in the underhive. Too many of them. Filthy, loud, vicious little creatures who fought over scraps and played games with sharpened metal and learned before they could read how to use a knife. I thought about them standing on floors that were, unbeknownst to them, growing thinner from below, the compacted foundations of the hive's lowest levels being consumed and replaced by organic tissue that was warm to the touch and pulsed with a heartbeat that was not their own. I tried to go back. I am not proud of what happened, but I need to tell you because it is part of the story, and the story requires completeness. I tried to go back to the hive. I went to the place where I had been expelled, the section of the outer shell where the maintenance platform jutted out, and the ladder descended to the ash waste surface. The platform was still there. The ladder was still there, but the door was sealed, and the wall was sheer, and no amount of pounding or screaming or bleeding my fists against the ancient metal produced any response from inside. The hive was deaf to the outside, by design. The same design that made it a perfect feeding apparatus, made it a perfect isolation chamber, a sealed system that could not receive information from its environment because its environment was not supposed to contain anything worth knowing about. The people inside could not hear me. They could not see me. They would never know what I knew, what I had seen, what was climbing the walls of their home with the patience of something that had been waiting since before the hive's first foundation stone was laid. I went back to the Nomads. There was nothing else I could do. The tall one was waiting at the settlement's eastern entrance, standing in the mist with its pump heart clicking at a rate I had never heard before, fast and irregular, the rhythm of a mechanical system under stress. It looked at me, I looked at it. And then it did something it had never done before. It reached behind its back and removed a device from the assembly of equipment mounted on its spinal frame. The device was small, metallic, cylindrical, with a needle at one end and a reservoir at the other. A syringe, or something that served the function of a syringe. It held the device out to me. An offering. A choice. I understood. The syringe contained whatever it was that the Nomads used to begin the process. The modification, the replacement, the long, incremental transformation from flesh to mechanism, from human to something else, from a creature that breathed and bled and feared to a creature that clicked and filtered and endured. The tall one was offering me what it had, what all of them had, what their ancestors had chosen when they discovered the truth about the hive and decided that the only way to survive outside it was to stop being the kind of thing that the outside was designed to kill. It was offering me a future. Not a human future. Not a future I would have chosen if I had any choice at all. But a future and a price. The tall one pointed east toward the feeding depressions. Then it pointed at my hand. Then it pointed east again, and the sequence of clicks that followed was the longest and most complex I had heard from any of them, a sustained cascade of percussive language that the other Nomads stopped to listen to. their pump hearts quieting, their filtration systems dimming, every mechanical body in the settlement attending to the Tall One's words with the gravity of a congregation receiving scripture. I did not understand the clicks, but I understood the gesture. Before the modification could begin, I had to go to the nearest depression. I had to kneel at its edge, and I had to put my hand into the dark material at its center. I had to let the organism taste me, learn my chemical signature, register me in whatever biological catalog it maintained of the things that walked on its surface. The nomads were not merely inedible, they were known. The organism recognized them the way an immune system recognizes the body's own cells, as self rather than other, as components rather than food. Without that recognition, the modification was meaningless. The organism would hollow me regardless of how much metal I put inside my skin. The syringe was the second step. The first step was the descent. I went. The Draenei Nomad walked with me, her pump heart clicking at the 3-beat rhythm that I knew was not coincidence. That was the ghost of a dead woman's habit persisting in the machinery that had replaced her heart. We reached the nearest depression. The dark material at its center was still, expectant, waiting. I knelt. The ground was warm beneath my knees. I could feel the pulse through the fabric of my ruined trousers, that enormous subterranean heartbeat, slow and constant and absolutely certain of itself. I extended my right hand. My fingers touched the surface. It was warm, wet, yielding. My hand sank into the wrist, and the sensation was not pain, but something beyond pain. A complete and overwhelming awareness of contact, of being known, of having every molecule of my skin catalogued and classified and assessed by something that had been processing organic matter since before the Imperium found this world and understood flesh the way a lexicographer understands words. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the surface released me. My hand came out undamaged, unmarked, but changed. I could feel it. A residue that was not physical but chemical, a signature that had been written into my skin at a molecular level, a mark that said, "This one is ours, this one walks, this one is not food." The Draenei Nomad clicked once, short, affirmative. It had accepted me. The organism, the vast, mindless, patient, endlessly hungry thing beneath the ash waste, had tasted me and decided to let me live. The ground trembled beneath us. The clicking of every pump heart in the settlement shifted, synchronizing for a moment into a single unified rhythm that sounded less like heartbeats and more like a countdown. Behind us, in the direction of the hive, I could hear a sound that I had heard once before, a deep geological groan of something enormous shifting, something structural and fundamental changing position. Not the hive's door this time, the hive itself, the foundations, the base of the structure, settling, tilting by a fraction of a degree that would be imperceptible to anyone inside, but that, from the outside, from where I stood in the ash waste with the chemical mist pressing against my face and the syringe in my hand, was visible as a slight but undeniable lean. The hive was moving. The organism beneath it was large enough now to shift the foundations of a structure that housed billions of people. It was adjusting, getting comfortable, settling into a new position the way a sleeper shifts in bed, a movement that is unconscious and irresistible and unstoppable by anything as small as the things living on its surface. I looked at the syringe. I looked at the hive. I looked at the tall nomad, at its lens eyes and its pump heart and its metal hands, and everything it had given up in order to keep existing in a world that was not designed for the survival of anything human. And I made my choice. Not a good choice. Not a brave choice. The only choice. The same kind of choice I had been making my entire life. the kind of choice the underhive teaches you to make, the kind where every option is terrible and the only criterion for selection is which one keeps you breathing for one more day. I took the syringe. The needle went into the vein inside my left elbow, and the liquid that entered my bloodstream was cold, so cold that I could feel it moving through my arm and into my chest and outward into my extremities. A spreading chill that did not numb but sharpened, that made every nerve ending report with a clarity I had never experienced, that made the chemical burn of the air in my lungs feel like a specific and catalogued datum rather than a generalized pain. The process had begun, the first step, the first modification, the first surrender of flesh in exchange for function, of humanity in exchange for survival. The tall one caught me when I staggered, its metal hands warm against my arms, its pump heart clicking steady and slow. And around us the settlement's domes hummed with the activity of nomads preparing for what came next. They had done this before. They would do it again. Every exile who found them, every human being expelled from the hive and left to die in the ash waste, every piece of discarded flesh that the organism did not manage to consume, they offered the same choice. Not salvation, not rescue. Continuation. The underhive's only gift, expressed in the language of needles and metal, and the slow, irreversible replacement of everything that made you who you were. The hive groaned again, louder this time. The lean was more pronounced, somewhere inside, somewhere in the lower levels, in the hab blocks and the workshops and the water treatment facilities, and all the cramped, miserable spaces where human beings lived their cramped, miserable lives. Something would be changing. Cracks in walls that had been solid for centuries. Floors tilting by degrees so small that only a cup of water on a flat surface would reveal them. Pipes bursting in sections that had never experienced structural stress before, flooding corridors with recycled water that would taste, for the first time, slightly different, slightly warmer, slightly sweet, because the water was no longer passing through the hive's filtration system alone, but through the organism's tissue as well, picking up compounds that would enter the bodies of the people who drank it, compounds that would change things, slowly, subtly, in ways that would not be noticed for generations, if they were noticed at all. The merger was beginning, not an invasion, not an attack. A merger. The organism was not consuming the hive the way a predator consumes prey. It was incorporating it, absorbing it, making it part of itself, the way it had absorbed the ash waste and the biological effluent and the centuries of dead bodies and industrial runoff, converting it all into biomass, into growth, into the slow and patient expansion of something that had no mind, no will, no intention. Just a function that it would perform forever until there was nothing left to perform it on. I am one of them now. The clicking is my language. The pump is my heart. The lenses are my eyes. I carry meat to the depressions, and I maintain the organs in the deep chambers, and I do not look up at the hive because looking up at the hive means thinking about the people inside, and thinking about the people inside means remembering that I was one of them, and that is a memory this body was designed to make me forget. The hive leans, the organism grows, the ash waste digests, and I click, click, click in the mist, carrying my offering to a god that is not a god, but a stomach. And the only truth that survives the transformation from flesh to metal is this. The hive was never a home. The walls were never protection. The doors were never barriers. They were valves. And the most horrifying truth of what exists outside the hive is that there is no outside. There never was. The hive and the waste and the organism are one system, one body, one hunger. And everything inside it, every man, woman, and child, every life lived and every death died within its walls, is digestion. Just digestion. Nothing more.